photograph was taken. It is a description, passed quietly between three senior courtiers who were in the corridor outside the king's private study at Windsor Castle on a Sunday evening in late autumn. They describe a sound they had never heard in their decades of service. Not a raised voice, not the crash of an object. A low, continuous, broken sound coming from behind a closed oak door that took them several seconds to recognize for what it was. King Charles III, Prince of Wales for 70 years, King for 2, was weeping, not the controlled, dignified grief of a funeral, not the wet-eyed sentiment of a milestone. Weeping, the kind that bends a person forward and will not let them breathe. And on the other side of that door, sitting beside him, holding a sealed red archive box between them on the carpet, were his son and his daughter-in-law. They had not come to confront. They had not come to accuse. They had come to tell him something no one had told him in 75 years of life, that they had read him, all of him. The parts he had sealed, the parts he had buried, the parts he had believed with every fibre of his being would die with him. And in telling him they had read those parts, and in telling him that they loved him anyway, William and Catherine did something no institution, no crown, and no ceremony had ever managed to do. They broke the king open. And what fell out of him in that room was not a secret to be leaked to a newspaper. It was a lifetime of grief that had never been witnessed. Before we walk through the 3 documents that William and Catherine found in the Queen's sealed private archive, the 3 secrets that, taken together, reconstruct the hidden interior life of King Charles III in a way no biography ever has, before we describe the moment the king read his own father's apology for the first time, and the moment he learned his mother once considered passing him over entirely, make sure to hit subscribe to Crown Watch and turn on the notification bell. Because this is not a scandal story, this is a grief story. And grief stories are harder to tell and more important to hear. To understand how this happened, we begin with the archive review. This is a routine process, though the public never hears about it. In the 18 months preceding a planned transition of duties, the heirs transition team conducts a comprehensive review of the sovereign's private archive. The purpose is administrative, identifying documents that must be transferred, classified, or sealed before the succession. William and Catherine's team had been working through the late Queen's private collection for several months, sorting correspondence, inventorying ledgers, and cataloguing personal effects. It is painstaking, quiet work, done by a small team of archivists under strict confidentiality. Catherine, who has taken a personal interest in the archival process, insiders say she views the archive as the institution's memory and therefore the institution's conscience, had been reviewing a specific subsection of the Queen's private papers, the Personal Reserve, a collection of documents Elizabeth kept separate from the official royal archives, stored in a locked cabinet in her sitting room at Windsor. These were not state papers. They were not constitutional instruments. They were, in the archivist's careful phrase, the sovereign's own. Birthday letters, family photographs, private memoranda. And, as Catherine discovered on the Thursday that changed everything, 3 items that were not meant to be found. The cabinet's lower drawer was locked. The key was not in the standard archive inventory. Catherine requested the key from the Queen's former dresser, who had retired 2 years prior, and who provided it with a hesitation that Catherine noted but did not comment on. Inside the drawer, beneath a layer of old correspondence, Catherine found a single red leather archive box. It bore no label, no date, no crest. But on the underside of the lid, in Queen Elizabeth's distinctive upright hand, were 4 words, "For the next, only." Catherine brought the box to William that evening. They sat together in their Kensington Palace study and looked at it for a long time without opening it. The inscription was clear, "For the next." It was addressed to the heir, to William. It had been placed in the Queen's private reserve deliberately, left for the person who would one day inherit not just the throne but the archive. It was, in effect, a message from a grandmother to a grandson, delivered through the only channel she trusted, the sealed cabinet and the passage of time. They opened it at 9:47 p.m. Inside, resting on a layer of tissue paper, were 3 items. Item 1, a slim leather journal, unmarked, its pages filled in a cramped, agitated hand that William recognised immediately as his father's. Item 2. A single envelope, sealed, addressed in Prince Philip's distinctive block capitals to my son Charles, bearing no postmark and no sign of ever having been opened. Item 3. A folded sheet of Buckingham Palace notepaper, 2 pages, typewritten, bearing the private secretary's reference number and a handwritten annotation in Elizabeth's hand. 3 items, 3 secrets, a journal, a letter, and a memorandum. Together they form a portrait of the king that no one, not his wives, not his children, not his mother, not his father. In full. Let me begin with the journal, because it is the oldest of the 3 and the most devastating. The leather journal was written over a period of 6 weeks in September and October of 1997. Charles was 48 years old. Diana had died in Paris on the 31st of August. He had walked behind her coffin at her funeral on the 6th of September. And in the weeks that followed, while the public watched him perform the rituals of grief with a stiff, composed face, he was writing every night, sometimes 2 or 3 pages, sometimes only a few lines. But he wrote, and what he wrote is not the measured philosophical meditation you might expect from a man of his education and temperament. It is raw, it is fractured, it is the writing of a man who believes he has committed an unforgivable act and who cannot find a way to live with it. I will not read the journal aloud in its entirety, because to do so would be a violation of the privacy it was written in, but I will describe its content because it is the foundation of everything that follows. In the earliest entries, Charles writes about Diana in the present tense, as if she is still alive, then corrects himself mid-sentence. He writes about her laugh. He writes about the day they first met. He writes about the moment he realized their marriage could not work, and the moment he realized he had not protected her from the consequences of that failure. He writes the sentence, and this is the sentence that William read twice before continuing. I did not kill her with my hands, but I killed her with my life, and I will carry that until I am dead and beyond. The middle entries are about his sons. He writes about William, then 15, and Harry, then 12. He writes that he watched them at the funeral and saw in their faces a grief he had caused, and that he believes absolutely that they will never forgive him. He writes that he has considered, seriously, removing himself from the succession, not by abdication, but by some quieter means, some withdrawal that would let William ascend without the shadow of his father's shame hanging over the crown. He writes that he has drafted a letter to the Queen on this subject 3 times and destroyed it 3 times because he knows she would not accept it, and because he knows, beneath the self-punishment, that the duty is the only thing keeping him upright. The final entries, written in October, shift. The self-accusation does not diminish, but it begins to sit beside something else, a terrible, exhausted tenderness. He writes about planting a garden at Highgrove in Diana's memory, though he never did. He writes about wanting to tell his sons the truth about their mother, about the marriage, about the choices he made, but knowing he cannot, because the truth would wound them further. And he writes a final entry, dated the 14th of October 1997, that is only 3 lines long. It reads, I will not be forgiven. I have accepted this. I will do the work. It is the only penance that lasts. William read the entire journal in one sitting. Catherine sat beside him and read it with him, her hand on his arm. When they finished, neither spoke for a long time. Catherine, according to those close to her, was the first to find words, and the words she chose were not about the institution or the archive or the succession. She said, He has carried this alone for 26 years. And William, who is not a man given to visible emotion, put the journal down and covered his face with his hands, because he understood, in that moment, that the father he had spent his life trying to impress, trying to understand, trying to protect the institution from, had been, beneath all of it, a man quietly drowning in a guilt he had never shown a single living person. The second item in the box was the envelope from Prince Philip. It was sealed with the Duke of Edinburgh's personal signet, addressed to my son Charles, in Philip's characteristic block capitals, and it bore no postmark, no stamp, no indication of ever having entered the postal system. It had been placed in the Queen's cabinet, which means Philip had given it to Elizabeth rather than sending it to Charles. He had written it, sealed it, and handed it to his wife with the instruction, presumably, that she deliver it. and she had kept it. Whether she chose not to deliver it, or forgot, or believed Charles was not ready, we do not know. But the letter had sat in the cabinet since, based on the paper stock, approximately 2017, the year of Philip's retirement from public duties. It had waited 7 years. The letter, when William opened it with an archivist's gloved hands, was 4 pages. Philip's handwriting in his final years was large, unsteady, and direct. The content of this letter is, in a sense, the mirror image of Charles's journal. Where Charles wrote about his failure as a husband, Philip wrote about his failure as a father. Philip apologizes. The word appears 4 times.
He apologizes for the coldness.
For the school he sent Charles to, the one Charles has described in private as the unhappiest period of his life. For the teasing, the dismissiveness, the public and private belittling. Philip writes that he now understands, in his 96th year, that the way he treated Charles was not discipline or character building, but the repetition of a wound Philip himself had received from his own father, and that he had passed it on because he did not know how to do anything else. The most extraordinary passage in Philip's letter is not the apology itself. It is a confession. Philip writes that for many years he was jealous of Charles, jealous of his sensitivity, jealous of his capacity for feeling, jealous of his closeness to his mother. Philip writes that he looked at his son's gentleness and saw in it everything he had been trained to suppress in himself, and that his instinct, rather than to protect that gentleness, was to punish it, because it frightened him. He writes, and this is the line that reportedly made Catherine set the letter down and look out the window for a long time. "You were the thing I was not allowed to be, and I made you suffer for it, and I am sorry, and I am proud of you, and I was never able to say either of those things while you could hear them." William read Philip's letter twice, then he placed it back in the envelope. Then he picked up the journal again and held both documents in his hands, the father's confession and the son's grief, and he said to Catherine in a voice she has described since as the most stripped I have ever heard him, "He has spent his whole life believing my grandfather was ashamed of him, and my grandfather spent his last years writing him a letter saying he was proud, and my grandmother never delivered it. That mice spent his famines." The box was the memorandum. It was typewritten on Buckingham Palace notepaper, dated March 2005, bearing the private secretary's reference number and a handwritten annotation in Elizabeth's hand that read simply, "Not for action. For record." The memorandum was addressed to no one. It was a private reflection, written by the Queen to herself, or perhaps to the archive, or perhaps to the grandson she knew would one day find it. It is 2 pages, and its content is the secret that, of the 3, carries the heaviest constitutional weight. In the memorandum, Elizabeth writes that in the years following Diana's death, and during the period when Charles's relationship with Camilla was becoming public and controversial, she considered, seriously and at length, the possibility of altering the succession. Not by removing Charles, but by creating a mechanism, she does not specify what, that would allow the crown to pass to William upon her death, bypassing Charles entirely. She writes that she consulted no one. She writes that she discussed it with no one.
She writes that she considered it because she feared, genuinely, that Charles was too wounded by his life to bear the crown without breaking, and that the institution might not survive his breaking. She writes that she ultimately decided against it. And the reason she gives is not constitutional, not political, not strategic. It is personal.
She writes that she looked at Charles during a private audience in 2004 and saw in his face a determination she had not seen before, a steadiness, a willingness to endure, and she concluded that to bypass him would be to confirm his deepest fear, that he was not enough, that he had never been enough, that the institution he had waited his whole life to serve had decided in the end that he could not be trusted with it, and she could not do that to her son. So she chose him. She chose his fragility over his bypass. She chose to let him bear the weight, and she wrote it down, and sealed it, and left it for the grandson, who would one day need to understand why.
William read the memorandum in silence. Catherine watched his face, and when he finished, he looked at her and said something that she has repeated since to those she trusts, because it reveals the man he has become. She doubted him, and then she chose him, and he has never known she doubted him, and he has never known she chose him. He has lived his whole life believing she merely allowed him.
That is the secret at the heart of the archive. Not a scandal, not a cover-up, a silence, a love that was never spoken because the institution its author led had taught her that love, once written down, becomes a document, and documents become dangerous. Now we arrive at the decision. William and Catherine sat with the 3 documents for 3 days. 3 days during which the archive box rested in their study, and they spoke about it in long, careful conversations that no one else heard. The question before them was not legal. The question was moral. They had 3 options. They could reseal the box and return it to the archive, preserving the silence. They could destroy the documents, ending the secret permanently. Or they could bring them to Charles. They could tell him they had read his grief. They could hand him his father's apology. They could show him his mother's doubt and her choice. They could, in other words, break the silence that had defined his life. Catherine, according to those close to her, argued for the revelation. Not because the documents needed to be acted upon, not because they changed the succession or the constitutional reality, but because she believed, with a conviction that William has described as the most certain I have ever seen her, that a person should not die without knowing they were loved, that Charles had lived 75 years believing he was a disappointment to his father and a burden to his mother, and that the truth, the actual documented truth, was the opposite. And that to keep that truth from him now, when he was aging, when his health was fragile, when the time left was uncertain, would be a cruelty dressed as discretion. William was torn. He understood Catherine's argument, but he also understood something else. His father had built his entire identity around the silence, around the penance, around the belief that he was unworthy and must therefore work harder, endure longer, suffer more quiet. To take that from him, to tell him his father was proud, his mother chose him, his grief had been witnessed, was to remove the architecture of his suffering. And William was afraid, genuinely afraid, that if you remove a man's architecture of suffering, you do not free him, you collapse him. In the end, it was Catherine who resolved it. She proposed a way of revealing the documents that was not an ambush, but an offering. They would not present the documents as evidence. They would not say, "We found this, and now you must feel differently." They would go to him. They would sit with him. They would tell him what they had found, and they would tell him why they had not sealed it back away. And then they would give him the choice to read or not to read, to speak or not to speak, to grieve or to remain as he was. They would not take his silence from him. They would give him back his truth and let him decide what to do with it. They went to Windsor on Sunday. They did not announce themselves through the usual channels. They arrived by car in the late afternoon, unaccompanied except for a single protection officer who remained at the gate. They were shown into the king's private study. Charles was at his desk, writing. He looked up when they entered, and those who know him say he knew immediately, not what they had found, but that they had found something. Because his son's face was carrying an expression Charles had never seen there before. A compassion that was not pity, a tenderness that was not deference, a look of complete, unguarded seeing. William placed the red archive box on the carpet between the 3 chairs. He did not put it on the desk. He did not slide it across. He set it down on the floor, between them, like an offering placed at a threshold. Then he spoke, and his words, reconstructed from the account he later gave to Catherine, were simple and without ceremony. "We found this in grandmother's cabinet. It was addressed to the next. We believe it was meant for me. We opened, and we found 3 things that belong to you. And we are not here to confront you. We are here because you should not have to carry them alone anymore." Charles looked at the box. He did not touch it. He looked at William. He looked at Catherine. And then very quietly he said, "What is in it?" William answered, "Your journal from 1997, the one you wrote after Diana died." Charles's face did not change, but his hand, resting on the arm of his chair, tightened. William continued, "A letter from grandfather, addressed to you. He wrote it in his last years. Grandmother kept it. It was never delivered." A pause. Charles's eyes moved to the box. William finished. "And a memorandum from grandmother, about the succession, about you, about a choice she made." The silence that followed lasted, by Catherine's account, nearly 2 minutes. Charles did not move. He did not. He sat with his hands on the chair arms and his eyes on the red box on the carpet, and something moved behind his face that his son and daughter-in-law had never seen move before. Then he reached down and picked up the box. He placed it on his lap. He opened it, and he took out first the letter from Philip. He read it in the room with them. He did not ask them to leave. He did not turn away. He read his father's apology, his father's confession of jealousy, his father's pride in the presence of his son and his daughter-in-law. And as he read, the composure he had maintained for 75 years began slowly to dissolve. Not all at once, not dramatically, but the architecture of it, the stiff posture, the measured breath, the careful distance between feeling and expression began to soften like ice in warm water. When he reached the line about pride, he stopped. He looked at William, and he said, in a voice that was no longer the king's voice, but a child's, "He was proud of me." William nodded. "He wrote it down, father. He sealed it. He gave it to grandmother to give to you. He meant—" Charles looked back at the letter. His hands were trembling. He read the line again. Then he set the letter down on the box. He did not pick up the journal. He did not pick up the memorandum. He sat with the letter from his father, and he began, slowly, to weep. Not the broken sound from the corridor that came later. This was the beginning, the first crack. The moment a man who had spent his life believing he was a disappointment discovered, on paper in his dead father's hand, that he was not. Catherine moved to sit beside him. She did not touch him. She simply sat close enough that he could feel she was there. William sat on his other side. The three of them remained in that position. Charles in the middle, the letter in his lap, his son on one side and his daughter-in-law on the other, while the king wept. And as he wept, he began to speak, not coherently, not in full sentences, but in fragments that, taken together, form the most honest account of his interior life he has ever given. He spoke about the school, about the years of trying to earn a word of praise that never came, about believing absolutely that his father had been ashamed of him, about carrying that belief into his marriage, into his parenting, into his entire adult life. Then he spoke about Diana, about the journal. He looked at William and said, "You read it?" William said, "I read it." Charles closed his eyes. "Then you know what I believe I did." William was quiet for a moment. Then he said the words that, more than any other in this story, mattered. "I read what you wrote, and I do not believe it, and Harry does not believe it, and we never have. You were not her death. You were her husband, and the marriage failed, and you have punished yourself for 26 years for a thing that was not yours to carry alone." Charles opened his eyes. He looked at his son, and for the first time in his life, he allowed himself to be told that the story he had written about himself was not the only story. Then Catherine handed him the memorandum. She did not explain it. She simply placed the 2 typewritten pages in his hands. Charles read them. He read them slowly. He read the passage about the Queen's doubt. He read the passage about her choice. And when he reached the final line, the line where Elizabeth wrote that she chose him because to bypass him would be to confirm he was not enough, something in his face changed completely. The grief did not leave, but it was joined by something else, something he had not felt in a very long time, recognition. The recognition that he had been seen, that his mother had looked at him in his worst years and chosen him anyway, not despite his fragility, because she refused to confirm it. This is the moment the sound in the corridor began. This is the moment the king broke fully, not because of the journal, not because of Philip's letter, but because of the memorandum, because of the choice. Because for 75 years, Charles had lived with the suspicion that he was a placeholder, an interim monarch, a man the institution tolerated rather than wanted. And now, in his mother's own hand, he held the proof that she had considered removing him and had chosen, deliberately, not to. That she had looked at his brokenness and said, "No, this one. I choose this one. He will carry it, and I will let him." The weeping lasted, according to the corridor account, for some time. William and Catherine did not leave. They didn't call for staff. They did not summon a physician. They simply remained. Catherine held Charles's hand. William sat beside him. And the king, who has spent his life being the person in the room who holds everyone else together, was held. For the first time in 75 years, he was the one being carried. And he let himself be carried. And that, more than any decree or any archive or any constitutional instrument, is the moment that changed the monarchy. Not because it was public, but because it was private. Because the institution's hardest, most guarded, most dutiful servant was allowed in a closed room to be weak. And the institution did not collapse. It simply made room. In the aftermath, 3 things happened that tell you how profoundly this moment altered the family. First, Charles asked William to keep Philip's letter. Not to seal it back in the archive, not to file it, to keep it. To hold it in his own possession, in his own home, where he could read it whenever he needed to. William took the letter. He keeps it in the drawer of his desk at Kensington Palace. He has read it by his own account 4 times. He will read it again. Second, Charles asked Catherine a question that surprised her. He asked, "Do you think she would have wanted me to find it, or was it meant for William?" Catherine considered this. Then she answered, "I think she meant it for whoever was ready to read it, and I think she trusted that the right person would be ready at the right time." Charles nodded. Then she trusted you to bring it to me." Catherine said, "She trusted the archive. I was just the one who opened the drawer." Charles smiled. It was, those present say, the first genuine smile they had seen from him in weeks. Third, and most significantly, Charles did not reseal the journal. He did not destroy it. He did not return it to the archive. He kept it. And a week later, he invited Harry to Windsor. The details of that meeting have not been disclosed. But Harry was photographed leaving the castle 2 hours later, carrying a small object wrapped in cloth, and his face in the telephoto images was wet. Believe Charles gave Harry the journal. Gave him the document in which their father wrote, in the darkest weeks of his life, that he believed his sons would never forgive him. And in giving it, Charles did something he had never done. He let his sons see his shame. Not to burden them, to release it, to say at last, "Here, this is what I carried. You do not have to carry it, but you should know I carried it for you." The constitutional implications of this revelation are, in the strict sense, none. The memorandum did not alter the succession. Philip's letter did not change the line of inheritance. The journal did not affect the sovereign's legal authority. Nothing in that red box changed the law, but everything in it changed the people who operate the law, and that, in the end, matters more. Because the monarchy is not a machine. It is a family that happens to run a machine. And when the family heals, the machine runs differently. Not louder, not faster, but steadier. With less friction. With less silence. With fewer keys hidden in drawers and letters never sent. Catherine's role in this story will, I believe, be studied for generations. She was not born into this family. She married into it. And yet it was she who opened the drawer. It was she who argued for the revelation. It was she who proposed the method, the offering, not the ambush. It was she who sat beside the king and held his hand while he wept. In doing so, she performed the deepest function of a future queen, not to rule, but to witness, not to govern, but to see. And in seeing the king clearly, in refusing to look away from his grief, she gave him the one thing the institution had never given him, permission to be human. What do you think? Were William and Catherine right to reveal the documents, or should they have resealed the box and preserved the silence? Does Charles deserve to know his mother considered bypassing him, even if the truth is painful? Should Philip's letter have been delivered in his lifetime? And does it matter that it arrived after his death? And what should happen to the journal? Should it remain with Charles, be given to Harry, or be sealed forever? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and this story, more than any we have covered, deserves the community's judgment. If you want to stay ahead of the royal stories the mainstream media will not touch, make sure you are subscribed to Crown Watch. Turn on the notification bell. Share this with someone who understands that the most important secrets are not scandals, they are silences, and that sometimes the bravest thing a family can do is open a drawer. Because in the House of Windsor, the crown is not the heaviest thing. The heaviest thing is the letter that was never sent, the apology that was never delivered, the choice that was never spoken. And the only way to set it down is to finally let someone read it. Stay curious, stay informed, stay questioning, and remember, every archive has a drawer that was never meant to be opened, and every drawer holds a truth someone was afraid to say out loud. Until next time, keep your eyes on the sealed boxes and your hearts open to the ones who carry them. Goodbye.